and NAIFA's proud 2020 diversity champion. After yesterday, I gotta tell you, I'm feeling even prouder, more excited, and blessed to be recognized. The cherry on top of it all is this incredible honor to serve as your MC for our first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Impact Week. And what a great start it was, wasn't it? I mean, it was a great first day, at least for me. I hope you guys all agree. You can bet that we've got another special one teed up for all of you today. Now, yesterday was filled with fantastic conversations. They were powerful, informative, insightful, and these conversations helped to change our industry and society for the better. And I want to thank NAIFA and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council for bringing us DEI Impact Week, which represents part of NAIFA's Talent Development Center, where you can find all sorts of additional resources. Now, whether you missed some of yesterday's programming, want to watch certain sessions again to find more gems of wisdom, or know a colleague who'd benefit from the great information and takeaways, you're in luck. Now, as we get started, please know that we're all in listen-only mode. You can use the chat feature to share your comments and ask your questions. It's now time to kick off our first session of the day, Using Your Voice, discussion on the role of DEI in advocacy. NAIFA's relationship with the American Council of Life Insurers, more commonly known as ACLI, is a long and strong one. The two organizations work together on issues that affect the insurance and financial services industry, its community of agents and advisors, as well as those American families and businesses that they collectively serve. Both stand committed to advancing DEI in our industry. We're delighted to welcome members of the political advocacy team at the American Council of Life Insurers. First is Joyce Meyer, ACLI's Executive Vice President for Government Relations. She's responsible for overseeing ACLI's federal, state, and international advocacy with a special focus on the financial and retirement security ACLI member companies provide to the families who count on them. We also welcome ACLI's Senior Vice President for Federal Relations, Kimberly Ross. She oversees ACLI's federal advocacy on financial services, tax, retirement, and income security issues. Before joining ACLI in December 2020, she served as Chief of Staff and Chief Counsel to Representative Joyce Beatty of the 3rd District of Ohio. At the controls of this panel discussion is NAIFA's very own Vice President of Marketing and Communications, Suzanne Carawan. Ladies, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Hello, Joyce. Hello, Kimberly. How are you? Good to see you. For once, we're not on an industry call of some sort. We just talk about what we do. So I'm delighted that you've joined us. And I think to start off today's session, what I think would just be really appropriate and get everybody a little bit more familiar, because we're just going to have a really good discussion here on an extremely important issue. But could you just, Joyce, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, et cetera, and then Kimberly asks you to do the same for you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you so much, NAIFA. It's really great to be with all of you. I feel like NAIFA has been such a big part of my career path for many years. I'm going to be giving away how many years exactly that is. I started out on Capitol Hill and worked in both the House and Senate. Most of my service on Capitol Hill was with Congressman Paul Ryan. I was with him since he was elected. He was my hometown congressman in Wisconsin. So if we have any Wisconsinites on here, special hello to all of you. I grew up just outside of Milwaukee, and with my time with Paul Ryan, I had basically joined him and was privileged to serve as his staff lead as his career progressed, both as a staff director on the House Ways and Means Committee. I was his chief of staff in Washington, D.C., and I was his deputy his deputy chief of staff when he became speaker. I served also in the White House, and I also served in the Senate on the Senate now. Then it was the Senate Government Affairs Committee. But I got to tell you, it was always a bright spot whenever members of NAIFA were in our office and interacted with us both on the road as well as during fly-in. So it's a special treat to be with all of you here today. Thanks so much for having us.
That's awesome, Joyce. Thank you for being here. And Kim, what about you? You know a couple things about being chief of staff?
Just a little. Thank you again, Suzanne and NAIFA, for having me. I've been with ACLI for about 90 days now, so it's really exciting to join this, your great conference that you're having on DEI, how forward thinking of you in this space. As you mentioned, I recently served the past 8 years as Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Joyce Beatty of Ohio. As many of you know, Ohio has a very rich financial services industry, particularly in her district where Nationwide is headquartered. So I had the opportunity to interface with a lot of NAIFA agents as well as with the industry. I was on the Hill for about 20 years, and during that time, I worked on the Committee on Veterans Affairs and dealt with insurance industry. So I'm happy to bring all of that here today and to be with you and share, what we're doing at ACLI and how advocacy is so important in the DEI space.
So that's fantastic. And Kim, I don't know if you know this, but I am in Ohio, and I've had the pleasure to meet Joyce Beatty many a time and right in the backyard. And this is how advocacy works, right? It's all those building relationships and networking, like, you know who you know, and I know this person, et cetera. So with that, let's get into it. So when we're talking today, I want to frame it up by saying, I want to make sure we're talking advocacy in general, but then making sure we're talking about the DEI piece as well. Because clearly, I think you both will agree that, that NAIFA, we are the storytellers of Main Street USA. That's how we kind of frame ourselves up. We're the voice of kind of the financial Main Street USA. And that Main Street USA, of course, in the United States, has been radically shifting over the last couple of decades. And so, of course, what we're trying to really accomplish is making sure that we have an advisor pool out there who is representative of our very diversified Main Street USA, is inclusive, knows how to work within these populations, et cetera. And then we want to make sure that we have a good spread, and that we need to have that also matched up, of course, with our federal legislators, et cetera. And so I want to make sure you're always getting to that flavor and understanding that. So I think we'll just start with kind of a general advocacy question to start with. And then if you want to, in your comments, couch it also within just general advocacy as just kind of as it is, and then how DEI fits in. So first and foremost, both of you have had long careers on Capitol Hill, et cetera, in district, et cetera. Let's talk about the voice of having that constituent walk in the door and start to talk about the issues that are important to them. Can you give your perspective from that standpoint, where you stand now? Because now you're kind of the bringers of that voice often, but can you talk about how powerful that is? Because I think we have a lot of times our members, or even prospective members, they're not really sure, right? Advocacy seems like this very abstract thing, and how does that work? And maybe there's somebody who does it for me, but it's not me. And they're not always sure where they fit into the equation. And of course, we're always trying to allow them to understand how important it is. But I think coming from your mouths would be far more powerful, because you've been on that other side. So there you are, you're sitting there, chief of staff, in any of the illustrious roles you've had. And here comes this group of people in to talk to you. Take it from there.
Sure, I can kick it off.
Yeah.
As you highlighted, member voices are just so important. We had a saying in our office that we developed of saying we are bringing the district to Washington and Washington to the district. And certainly when NAIFA members and any advocates who come in, that's exactly how we see them. as being the people who are on the ground and bringing their stories to us. As we know, so many of us know that the greatest stories are what inspire the greatest policy a lot of times. And it also inspires even legislation. It is these stories that can be the avenues of creating the greatest change. And so we cannot overstate that. My former boss did not represent a majority minority district, as many people think, although she is Black, she did not represent a minority district. And so bringing those voices and having them, we had everyone from the Ohio Farm Bureau to OSU to Ohio Health to the nationwides and others coming into our office. And so we wanted to make sure everyone had a seat at the table. And that's how we see members, that they're creating seats at the table. And it's just so important to have them there informing the policy that's going to impact, regular everyday people.
Yeah, Joyce, what about you?
Yeah, no, gosh, everything Kimberly said touched on just how important the voices are from members of NAIFA. The only thing I would add is that what you do and what you provide predates the meetings you have with members of Congress and their congressional staff. I know for me, and some of you may have heard me tell the story, my introduction to the industry was through an agent, a life insurance agent. You're there for all of the personal, deeply personal moments in your customers' lives. For me, my introduction to the industry was a very dark time. My brother, who was 13 at the time, was riding his bike and was struck and killed instantly. It was the darkest time for my family. We were a Filipino immigrant family living outside of Milwaukee. And I remember everyone who came to our home, including our priest and our deacon, who we knew for many, many years. Our deacon was also our agent, our insurance agent. And he reminded my parents that they had a small policy on each of their children, including my brother. And I remember that moment of relief for my parents that they didn't have to worry about burial costs for my brother. In this horrible moment of tremendous grief, you were all there for my family. And fast forward to the time when all of you would come in to meet with us, or even just, when you would meet with and talk to my boss, or when I was back home in the district running into members of NAIFA in the neighborhoods, at the grocery store. That's the moment I think of when I think of the message that you bring and when you advocate. So it's the voice you bring comes with that personal connection that each staffer, that each member of Congress has with you in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And they know the constituents very, very well. And the stories that you bring carry tremendous weight. So I think in terms of providing not only your perspective and your insights, but sharing those stories from members of the community, as Kimberly said, it is one of the moments where it can inspire great policies and great solutions. So, and much of that is also the perspective you bring from the diversity, equity, and inclusion side. In Wisconsin, growing up in Milwaukee, it was a very ethnic community. There was a lot of ethnic pride and sharing, and that also, I know, was reflected in the agent workforce in the community. So I think that you cannot underestimate the important voice you bring because of the connections you've already have with not only members of the community, but members of Congress as well as their staff.
So I think there's so much in there, and that's just such a powerful story, Joyce. Thank you for sharing that deeply personal story. And I think one of the difficult parts of insurance in particular is that it's one of those products that you don't realize how important it is until you go through something like that, or you know somebody. And usually not everybody has, with COVID, there are many more people who have, of course, this is top of mind because of COVID, et cetera. And maybe that's one of the positives that's come out of COVID, is that we can be a little bit more advanced thinking and understand that we don't have all the time in the world. And that's one of those things we don't know. But just to share that kind of story as well, it's even connecting sometimes when there isn't a connection. Like, for example, my father, I'll share a personal story on my part. My father was a small business owner. We always had this insurance agent named Astrid, who'd been part of my life since I could remember. Astrid was there. She, would give us hockey tickets. She'd show up all the time, and she would. But turns out, my mom ended up having esophageal cancer. She was a case study. Nothing was covered. We blew through all of our savings, the business, et cetera, et cetera. She died when I was 19, my first year of college. And my dad had tons of insurance on himself in the business and not a thing on my mother. And so Astrid, I never even made the connection that I should have life insurance, et cetera, until way later, many years later, when I'm looking at my own children running around and I'm going, what am I doing, right? What am I doing? I remember back this woman, but I didn't make all these connections and these pieces. And even though I'd gone through that process, I was so young, I didn't really understand the implications and lifelong implications of not having that policy, which has changed the trajectory of my own life. And still to this day, I suffer kind of from the effects of that. So I say all that because that's the type of story, when you're cringing, et cetera, that I tell all of my people, especially now that I work at NAIFA. And I tell that story, like, listen, if you're thinking that, the whatever the case might be, the partner, the wife, the spouse, et cetera, if you don't think about these needs to have that, you need to think again, right? Because we know as an American population, we're underserved, right? We know we don't have enough really life insurance in particular in place for the most American families. And so when we talk about that, and now let's put it back into talking about those stories, of course, of anything, of disabilities, of death, of all the hate crimes that we're seeing, they're powerful. So let's talk about, again, one thing I wanted to ask both of you is the stories that that come that are so compelling that I thought was great, Kimberly, the way you phrase that stick with you. How does, and I think people want to know this, how does a congressional, representative, a senator, et cetera, how do those filter to them, if you will? Because as you said, you've got everybody, all sorts of organizations walking in the door, everything from probably national, NFIB to Farm Bureau to this, the doctors, the lawyers, everybody's walking in. How do those filter out? Kind of where would you, how does the legislator discern that? And how does that go into their kind of policy work? Because as a congressional leader, they have to be such a jack of all trades. So how do they kind of get up to speed on these topics and kind of sift through all that information? Can you kind of talk about the behind the scenes there of where that comes in? Joyce, do you want to start with that?
Sure. No, absolutely. So it's such an important question, and it's, one thing I will say, I guess I'll start with the actual action item. Anytime a member of NAIFA, an agent would come to Paul in the district. Maybe they run into each other gassing up at the gas station, or maybe they see each other at one of his kids' games or a school event. And sometimes what would be shared is, hey, what do you think about such and such policy? Or what are you hearing in regards to what's going on the budget? There's another issue that's coming up here on the retirement side with, any thoughts on how this is going to play out? Anytime my boss would hear from someone, from one of the agents, it always turned into an action item for the staff to do research, to make sure that the boss is briefed up on the issue. And also, my boss would also be eager to respond and follow up with the agent. And your constituents, you're not only constituents, but you also represent constituents among your customer base. So this is something that, like I said, it always turned into an action item and research and dialogue. I think that it's because of that connection. And sometimes it would just be a brief introduction, happen to run into each other. It's also knowing and seeing the face in the community, right? So it's just as important as a congressional fly-in or advocacy in an office. It's also the interaction back home in the district. And I think that's where that's where the genesis is of not only policy, but also relationship building, much of what we all do. The other thing that is unique to you, the storytellers of Main Street, is you can translate policy into the effect of the benefits at the individual constituent level, at the individual customer level. I remember one agent telling my boss, my customers don't think in terms of buying a life insurance policy in order to figure out how to structure their tax planning. They're thinking in terms of protecting their kids if something happens to them because of the mortgage that they have, because they own a small business, because of education expenses in the future if something happens to them. And it's that kind of, there's no public policy in that moment. It's more what informs the consumer and what draws them to the need for financial protection that all of you provide. So that's what translates into action, an action item for a policy maker. And it's many times it's rarely a partisan issue. It really is a constituent issue.
Kimberly, you have any comments on that? You want to add anything?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. When constituents come into the office, whether they're meeting with the member of Congress, the senator, or the chief of staff, or whomever on the staff, that information gets trickled up and down because it's so important. Not to state the obvious, but basically, members are servants. They see themselves as servant leaders to the people, and in order to do that, you have to hear the stories. A member may not be in every meeting. They may not be able to meet with NAIFA every time they come, but I can tell you that because NAIFA is influential, they know that the life insurance industry is so important to their constituents, to things like one of the things that I know we're going to get into is closing the wealth gap. We know that insurance plays a big part in that. We know that in your case, if there had been an insurance policy for your mom, there would have been a greater transfer of intergenerational wealth, right? And so we know and members know this too. They're people too. They have, families and children and grandchildren that they are looking to make sure are secure for the future. And those sorts of overarching policies of things that are going to, set people up for a retirement, a safe and secure retirement, that are going to result in when the breadwinner or even one of the, caretakers, right, is no longer in the household, that there be a way to fill that gap, to fill that benefits gap. And members are, these issues are top of mind for them, because when those gaps aren't filled, then there has to be things have to come in to fill that on the policy front. And oftentimes we know that that's when you get into the loggerheads of, are we going to focus more funding in social areas, or are we going to focus more funding in other areas? And instead of that, we have an industry that can be used and designed, that is designed to secure families and futures. And that they know that, and those messages get back to our members, to the members of Congress and senators.
So I just want to reiterate a couple of things that I heard both of you say, and just, this is like a true or false statement, because some of the things I heard you say, because I think there is a myth out there that, who am I, right? I'm just one constituent, one voter. No, they listen to a million people. I'm not important somehow. Like it's that thing. And what I heard from you both very clearly is not only the action you take, maybe it's not the hundreds of thousands of people calling into the office that everybody thinks it is, or they think somebody else is taking care of this, but that taking that action, whether it's letter writing or calling or showing up, is not only super important, but what I loved that you said, Joyce, is that it actually creates an action item, right? And so that's a true or false statement, right? So that's a true statement, that that stuff is not a small matter.
Not at all. Very true.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I don't know that people, I don't know where that's fallen. I don't know that people really understand. It's like kind of getting reconnected with how important, maybe this year, if again, nothing else, it's shown how important voting is, right? And the ability to vote, but having that voice and making sure you understand how important your voice is and using it. So I think on that note, let's pivot to some tough topics. So I want to talk first about a couple of things that have happened recently. So Joyce, recently you signed onto with more than 60, I believe, people, right, about talking about Asian American hate and what that is happening. Can you talk a little bit about, your impetus for doing that, where you're seeing things, et cetera, and the support that you got in doing so?
Sure, thank you. It's such an important issue, and it's desperately sad that it's an important issue. One of the things we're seeing more and more, sadly enough, are these divisions in our country. With Asian American Pacific Islander community, we're seeing more focus on everything from harassment to actual violent acts against members of the AAPI community. And many of us who served in public service, in government, on both sides of the aisle, we were very deeply affected, as I know many were here too, in seeing these images, in seeing the rhetoric that's been used. And what spurred us to action, is when you see these images and of violence and taunting and harassment, what I personally am seeing is that could be my aunt, that could be my mom, that could be my uncle, that could be my father. And I know, you know, it's not unique to the AAPI community, but it's just part of being human. We also felt really strongly that we had to speak with a unified voice because it was not a partisan issue. This was an important issue that deeply affected both sides of the aisle. It is not an issue that that would basically be seen as one-sided. So as many of us were talking, we realized, you know, we can put together a joint statement outlining all of this and the importance of policymakers to focus on solutions. I know that it's not just a statement that could trigger action as much as it is the voices of that joint statement. And just as we say here, the voices that all of you bring as well. It was one of these things where, you know, among the AAPI community who have served both as former staffers and government officials, we were all connecting and realizing this moment where we could add our voice, and where DEI is so much more important now more than ever as we bring into sharper focus the solutions as opposed to the divisions. And so that's what motivated this common motivation among all of us to join in this statement to address the AAPI community's concerns with Asian hate.
So one thing on that is what I'm seeing, and I'm hopeful that we're seeing a trend again towards rediscovery of the power of institutions, right? And having an institutional voice. We become such an individualistic society that everything is about the, you know, the individual influencer, right? It's the selfie generation. And I hope that what we're seeing is this idea that, hey, if we come back together in a collective unified voice, we can actually have more of an impact that's maybe not so polarizing, right? But that can be more representative, which is what we're, you know, seemingly the intent of our whole country. And then we can kind of get back to that, right? This idea of, if you will, the associations, the groups, the entities coming together and unifying that and saying, hey, now's the time so we can come together and be able to make a greater impact. And I'm hopeful to see that. So we applaud you, Joyce, for doing that. We, of course, supported, and we put out a very similar statement in support. Speaking of other groups, and Kimberly, I'm going to turn it over to you. Because for as you said, you've worked for many, many years for Joyce Beatty. She's head of the Black Caucus, right? She is their chair of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion. So in doing all of that, can you give us kind of a peek, if you will, into some of the diversity objectives that are going on in the Hill?
Right. So I had the privilege of working for the Congresswoman as the Financial Services Committee in the House was standing up its inaugural Diversity and Inclusion Subcommittee. As you know, there is no equal on the Senate side of the chamber. And so this is, you know, fairly groundbreaking, and it was birthed because of the foresight of Chairwoman Maxine Waters, who feels that she wants to leave her part of her legacy is that she wants to diversify the financial services industry. She wants it to be accessible to all. She knows that that's the only way we can close the wealth gap. That we need to diversify boards and C-suites that and workforces of the financial services industry, you know, and of course, including the insurance industry. she wants to make sure that there's business diversity, that there are diverse asset managers, that you are bringing all, whether it be your accountant, your lawyer, the asset managers, that there's diversity in the business space as well, not just like supplier diversity, which is great. But it also means that we need diversity in our federal agencies as well. The agencies can't be off the hook. It's not just industry. It's going to take, all of our collective drive to want to move to greater accountability. What the committee has done primarily is sent out letters requesting information on the diversity of the workforce and C-suites of a number of companies, starting with the larger banks and most recently with the large diverse asset managers of 400 billion in assets or more. And it's not so much to point fingers or to point blame or to shame anyone, because where does that get you, right? There has to be a willingness, but there also needs to be accountability. There can be no true diversity and inclusion achieved without accountability. And so many people are lost on trying to figure out exactly what diversity what it should look like in their companies, but there's no prescription. It's more of your intentionality, that you are intent and you want to be impactful on DEI. And I think that's what the committee is focusing on more so than, they're collecting the information because we know that diverse companies outperform those that are less diverse. And we know that diversity is good for the bottom line. But stating your propositions, your value propositions is a lot harder than actually being accountable to them. And that's, I think, what the focus of the committee is on, is making people more aware that there is, our nation can be so much greater. We know that we are experiencing a great boom right now, but we could actually be even further along where we wouldn't have such a huge racial wealth gap if there had been greater diversity in the financial services space and in all aspects of America, right? It's not just in our industry. It's, as I said, it's in the federal government. We know that it's been in mortgages, it's been in all aspects. And so just trying to at least start here where, NAIFA, we know that there's a saying, right? Ducks like ducks. So with NAIFA, if there's a diversification of the workforce of the agents who are, bringing these maybe marginalized families that, maybe they can afford insurance, but they just can't figure out why. But if someone from their community is a part of NAIFA, who's an agent who can tell them about it. One of the things that right before I started law school, I had someone meet with me who was an insurance agent. And at the time I was trying to figure out whether I was going to law school and what was going on. And I can just say it was from Primerica. And they were telling me, Kimberly, you are your greatest asset, and I had never heard that before. And that's how you're going to be the person that is the most worthwhile asset, not your house, not your car, not anything. And so, saying those sorts of things to family, that sort of financial education, financial empowerment is so important. And just to bring it all together, that's why, NAIFA's emphasis on DEI and diversifying its agent forces and diversifying the voices. Look at the panel we have today, right? This is a wonderful example of what diversity can bring and why it's so meaningful.
We'll just call ourselves a trifecta from now on.
Exactly.
what, on that one, I do want to touch on that because you mentioned the racial wealth gap. So, specifically, and you did a great job explaining, but other comments, for what can our financial advisors do? Because to close that racial wealth gap, we need a lot of policy to help do that. So where do you see our financial advisors fitting into that equation?
I can
Kimberly,
start.
go ahead.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, they're the nexus to this equation of those who have and those who, I shouldn't even say have not, those who want. It's not like those who don't have don't want it. It's just that a lot of times they don't know how to go about getting it. There have been so many doors closed in their faces and avenues blocked for them to have, equal access. And that's why, not to get too policy wonky focused on it, but that's why things like Regulation BI and the fiduciary issue, they are so meaningful because we need a set standard that people can rely on, that the industry can rely on. We can't keep going back and forth. And we know that, those who have and who have money and who have means, they're impervious to whether we have a Regulation BI standard or a fiduciary standard, right? It's only those who are marginalized and who are income sensitive who are going to be impacted if we move to a different standard. And that's why we need the voices of NAIFA to come to the table and say that, like, we cannot keep changing these standards, SEC and DOL and members of Congress. We need a set standard so that we can close the benefits gap. We can help close the wealth gap. And we know that insurance is one of the great trajectories into closing the wealth gap on all levels. And other than owning a home, definitely protecting yourself against adverse actions is going to be the way, as you so eloquently put it, Suzanne, that everyone needs to have that level of protection and empowered to have access to it.
So Joyce, do you have any additional comments on that?
Yeah, oh my gosh, Kimberly is so right on all points there. And the issue of best interest, regulatory best interest, I know thanks to NAIFA and your members and teaming up along with us in the states, we've been able to secure adoption of regulatory best interest policies in, I think we're up to 9 states, hopefully closing in on 2 more, if not more. And I think that's an important part of our dialogue with federal policymakers as well. As Kimberly said, we got to bring the home states to Washington and vice versa. I think too, another part that's so important about a policy like that is just it's the need to preserve the relationship that all of you have with your customers. Regulatory best interest is an important part of that. But it's also important because, in the relationships you have, you're also the financial educators for consumers. You're the ones who introduce how people in the community can get the financial protection they seek for their families. And, policies that may interrupt that or intrude on that can be make diversity, equity, and inclusion that much harder. And it makes affordable solutions that you share with customers so much tougher to make it affordable and accessible. So that's why we've placed top priority on that, and are very grateful for the partnership that NAIFA and has with ACLI on making sure that we continue to advocate on these strong policies together.
Well, thank you so much. I know we're at time. We could talk all day, but thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Joyce. And I want to
Thank
really
you.
just thank you. We love our partnership together and we need to continue to do good work. And for those of you who are out there, if you're not NAFA members, please join us. You can see how important it is. And it's not enough to say that somebody else's job, because it's our job, right? That's why we talk about the power of you, the power of us. So please join us. If you are a member, thank you so much. Please get involved. Congressional conference is coming. I'm sure these ladies will be part of that as well, and we'll see them soon. So with that, Stephen, I'll
Yes.
turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
you.
so much. Exciting is probably not a word that probably captures all of the changes going on in Washington. And it's got to be fascinating to walk in your shoes. Thank you so much, Kimberly and Joyce, as well as to ACLI for sharing how political advocacy and the increasing role of DEI are vital to financial professionals and the lawmakers alike in addressing the financial security of us all. Mahalo. And thank you also to our own Suzanne, who I called yesterday Carawan, and this a little earlier today, Carawan, and it really is Suzanne Carwin. I hope I said it right. So Suzanne, you're amazing. Thank you for making it an amazing panel. Now let's take a moment to chill away from our computer screens for a moment, but don't stray too far away, because we got Kimsey Tran Gilmer, who's up next to enlighten us about marketing to the military community. See you just before 1 p.m. Eastern. Aloha.